morning, and it's great to be here. I'm Steve Saxon. I'm a partner with McKinsey, and my home is Shanghai. Although initially, as you can tell, I started off in London, so I joined McKinsey 18 years ago in London. I moved out to Singapore, and I've spent the last 15 years now working across Asia, mostly with the Asian airlines, but also some in the Middle East as well. Athens is a great place to come back to, and increasingly has more and more links with China as well. So I've actually spent a lot of time here recently with some of my Chinese clients who've been putting in infrastructure investments. And as you may know, some of the only direct flights into Athens from Asia are actually with the Chinese carriers. There's a big growth of China and links to Athens. I'm especially pleased that I'm just made it. Despite my best laid plans, I was meant to arrive nice and early, giving myself time to bed in, flying over through Abu Dhabi. Unfortunately, as I waited at the airport in Shanghai and just watched my plane get later and later and later, I realized I was going to miss the connection. So ran over to the Turkish Airlines guys, pleaded with them despite that it was totally full, that they could get me that they could find me a seat, and I managed to make it just in time. So thank you to everyone. It's good to be here. I'm going to talk for half an hour or so. The more this is a discussion, not a presentation, the better. So either as I talk through, if there's questions or you've got different points of view, please do speak up. There's also time for afterwards, I think, a panel and some more discussion. There's a huge amount of expertise in this room, and the more this can be a dialogue for us, the better. I spend most of my time working with airlines across a wide range of topics. That's included a number of things on procurement, and that's everything from how do I go, what aircraft should I buy, how do I negotiate with Boeing and Airbus and the lessors, to what can I do about my monopoly airport provider, how can I redesign my catering. And so I'm coming at this as sort of an airline generalist rather than a procurement specialist. I think that's where truly this event will help us, is bringing those two things together, the procurement expertise and the airline generalist. I'll start by talking a bit about the industry, and then spend most of the time looking at procurement and the role procurement can play to help make your airlines successful. Aviation is an industry we all love. We're in this business not just because it's a job, but because it's a passion and it's a calling. And I think that's probably true for everyone here. And aviation generates enormous amounts of value for the world. 3.4% of global GDP, that's like more than $2 trillion, is supported either directly or indirectly by aviation. It makes business links happen. It allows tourism. It lets cultures mix. We all know that aviation is absolutely a force for good, and it's why we're here. But, at least historically, it's not been a terribly good industry at actually making returns for us, the airlines in the room. Now, this is historically, so this looks over the last economic cycle at who made the money. And our suppliers, the people we negotiate against on a day-to-day basis, kind of make some money. This is economic profit, so it's basically looks at the profits you're making and takes off the cost of capital. So if it's positive, you're returning cost of capital, you're creating value for shareholders. The aircraft manufacturers do reasonably well. On the cargo side, forwarders, air navigation, handlers, global distribution systems all make pretty good money. Travel agents these days just about break even. Airports actually destroy value. That's mostly driven by the US, where there's a lot of publicly held airports without an economic incentive. If you actually break down the airports number, looking at the privately held airports and the European airports, they are positive. But the elephant here is obviously the airlines. And the airlines across the economic cycle, as I think we know, have destroyed significant amounts of value. Warren Buffett himself said, look, if I was there at Kitty Hawk when Orville flew his first flight, as a service to future capitalists, I would have shot him down. It is an industry which over the last 11 economic cycles has destroyed value in every single one of them. But that's history. And yes, it's a long history. So the the black line here looks at the cost of capital for airlines, and the blue line looks at the return on capital. And we've had large amounts of time. Yes, there have been some years better than others, but never did it sustainably return cost of capital. With the exception of recently. The last 3 years, I think, have been much better for all of us. Of course, within this, there are still some airlines which are doing better than others. The US is obviously a particular source of high profits and high returns at the moment. The Asian region where I come from has a number of carriers who are still struggling quite a bit more in terms of returning cost of capital. But overall, things are looking significantly more positive. After being out of the business for 15 years, Warren Buffett finally re-entered investing in airlines. And he didn't just invest in one, he invested in all 4 of the largest US carriers, taking a very bullish position that this is an industry which has managed to fix itself. That said, this is still a hugely challenging industry. You add together all the profits of all the airlines in the world last year, it's still lower than Apple. And we need to remember this is still an industry which has got perishable inventory, cutthroat pricing, perfect competition with customers going to online portals where they see one against another. Very volatile demand. Typically, you see ordering exceeding expected demand. There's long lead times for new aircraft, so that leads to high cyclicality. And then, what do we care about? Factor costs continue to go up. Our customers continue to be fickle and very price-driven. And of course, there are threats. I think we all worry about disintermediation, not just from existing travel agencies, but also from potential new intermediaries taking on a digital channel. We as airlines don't want to be reduced to what the telecoms providers have become and basically be the dumb pipe transporting people. We want to own the customer, but there are other people fighting for that position. So there is profitability on average at the moment. Some struggle more than others. For all of us, though, it's critically important to continue to control costs. This is actually my favorite chart in the whole, whenever I present, because it really hits home what is the problem which airlines face. And this is a long time series. Look at the number on the left. 1956 is when this chart starts. And this looks at real RASK, so unit revenue, and real unit cost over time. These only go in one direction, and that's down. Why? So we are all working incredibly hard to control costs. New aircraft are more efficient than older aircraft. The new engines burn less fuel. We get economies of scale as we increase the size of aircraft. We get economies of scale as we build networks and we flow more and more passengers through it. We innovate with revenue management systems, and these days our planes aren't 50, 60% full, they're 80, 85% full. We invest in automation. We smooth the passenger's journey through the airport. We constantly innovate to find new and better ways to serve the customer and drive down the cost. And then we pass all of that benefit on to our customers. So the single scariest number on this page is that R squared here equals 0.99. So we've been innovating as an industry, driving down cost, driving down cost, driving down cost, and we pass all of that back on in terms of unit revenues. And that's basically because it's an incredibly competitive industry. As soon as we're able to get an improvement, others copy it, competition plays its part, and eventually those benefits flow through to the customer. Great news, it's stimulated huge amounts of travel for us, but it creates a consistent pressure for airlines that they must focus on reducing cost. Every year, need to try and create a sustainable advantage, and ideally one which moves cost down quicker than competitors. But I don't think we see this line starting to move in any other direction than down. At the same time, though, there's a lot of pressure. So the unit cost has declined over time, but we all know in this room that there are lots of factors which are pushing up factor costs. When was the last time that your staff agreed to a pay decrease? Unions play a large role in this industry, more in some regions than others, but play a large role. Pilot wages, cabin crew wages are going up. Salaries of our staff are going up. When was the last time you knew an airport which actually reduced its charges? When did overflight charges ever come down? They don't. They're pretty much monopoly providers, and the pricing only seems to go in one direction, up. Boeing and Airbus might be innovating, but every new aircraft they come up with has an escalation clause in it. Here's the price you pay, and next year it's going to be 6% more, and 6% more, and 6% more. So while we're in a environment that unit revenue declines, we need to keep unit cost declining. Our factor costs continue to increase. And that, I think, is the challenge for all of us, both as aviation professionals and procurement professionals. How do we continue to innovate? How do we continue to drive down cost through those innovations at a time when we need to be delivering savings? Fuel is the unknown here, it's up and down. Of course, fuel is absolutely to a controllable category as well, and things that we as procurement professionals need to look at. Remember earlier when we looked at who makes the money in this industry? It's not the airlines, a lot of it's the suppliers. Why? Heavily due to industry structure. So there's a lot of monopoly suppliers here. Athens Airport has some of the highest charges in the world. People still fly here. Why? Because customers want to go to Athens. If you want to serve Athens, you've not got much choice. You've got to fly to this airport. So many cities, there's only one monopoly provider. Even at an airport, you might not have a huge amount of choice over the ground handlers, the caterers, the lounge providers, and so on. You're restricted in terms of choice of suppliers. You don't have choice of governments. You're flying from China across to Europe. You're going to have to overfly Russia. You don't have any choice but that. And again, you're subject to a monopoly supplier. Even then, there's a lack of choice in we may all try and negotiate hard against Boeing and Airbus and think they're making huge margins. In some ways, they're doing as a service to the industry as well, though. Boeing and Airbus have a role in playing in sort of tempering the demand of airlines. So airlines have all start to make money, all go and order. What happens? The order book just extends. So maybe they increase production rate a little, but Boeing and Airbus are playing a good role in terms of stopping the industry getting too much oversupply. However, there's only really two of them. Maybe you could argue three, but even the C series is now Airbus. So there's only really two manufacturers who don't compete too heavily against each other. There's one or two engine choices on most of them. You want to fly somewhere, you don't have huge choice of the catering provider, the handling provider. And there's lots of long-term contracts here with hidden price escalations in them, especially maintenance contracts, power-by-the-hour contracts, dare I say it, IT vendor contracts. And the industry has in general suffered for so long in terms of having a lack of cash that they've often preferred variable pricing to actually investing. So I'll pay you per transaction, I'll pay you per booking. I'll pay you per hour of the engines on the wing, rather than saying, okay, I'm going to invest in it. And given we're all growing, any contracts which link to transactions inevitably escalate over time. So suppliers are making money partially because the suppliers are actually in quite a good position. But it's partially because airlines themselves are not that great at procurement. So McKinsey has a survey which we call Global Purchasing Excellence, where we work with airlines and we score them across a series of different categories. How well does procurement link with strategy? What are the capabilities? How good is category management execution and the structure and systems? And basically we can look at the scores. And this outer one, the dark blue line here, is the average, is the top quartile score across all industries. And the light blue line here is where the airlines in our survey are. So on all parts of this, airlines don't perform as well as top performing companies. So yes, suppliers make our life hard, but there's a lot that we can do ourselves to try and improve these different areas. And that's what I'm going to spend the rest of the time talking about today. So what do leading procurement teams do? In our view, and very much welcome the discussion. Procurement, first of all, shapes demand. The last thing you want is to only be brought in as the procurement team once the business has already chosen what it wants. Many times, so basically, therefore, gets involved early. Too many procurement teams, I know, complain like, oh, wait, the business has already perfectly specified what it wants, and it even knows who it wants to go and buy from, and it just hands over to us and say, now go and get the best price. And we all know that at that point, you've got almost no negotiating leverage. So good procurement teams need to be involved early, working as a partner with the business in actually shaping the demand in what we buy. How do you get there? Well, procurement needs to earn the right to be involved early. Like, partially you can have this dictated from the top down, oh, you must involve procurement, but many airlines I've seen, this sort of lip service gets applied, the business puts too much specifications on it and still brings in procurement only late and pays lip service to it. Procurement needs to be seen by the business as adding value all the way through, and therefore the business wants to bring in procurement early as a partner to help them shape demand. Monopoly suppliers is a big problem, so the other thing procurement can really do is to creatively stimulate supply. And there's lots of interesting ideas here across categories. I'll share some, and I think we can discuss more later on in our category management discussions. And it gets supported by the right tools. It's essential to have the right data, information, whether it's auction tools, whether it's supplier management tools to support through this. I'll talk about each of them. First one, if we want to keep cost going down, we can't have absolutely the best of everything across the entire airline. And some procurement teams I've worked with have actually really started to get very involved together with the customer experience team in shaping what actually makes the difference. Like, of course, the customer team wants the best business seat out there, fantastic lounges, great economy class catering, personal service at check-in, great frequent flyer and loyalty scheme, great wine, basically the best, and they all want to go and try and win awards. Where procurement can really help, though, is getting involved early about what actually matters, what actually makes the difference to the customer. And that really gets into willingness to pay, helping the business figure out what does the customer value, and therefore how should we be trading off these different areas. We worked with a number of carriers. We used something called a conjoint analysis, which many of you might be familiar with. You present people with different options, and you ask them to choose between them. And through doing this a series of times, you can determine what really does the customer value. We did this with a couple of carriers, and what did this lead to, for example? We worked with one carrier who was looking at the business class cabin, and we're like, okay, actually, when you run this kind of survey, what really matters for the frequent business customer is quality of sleep. And they value the flat bed, they value the duvet, and they value, obviously, on time and things and such like. But they don't really value all the other stuff part of the product. Like, of course, it's nice to have. Like, it's not like they don't want catering and they don't want amenity kits, but actually that's not what's driving the customer's choice. So what do we do with this carrier? We put full flatbed on all regional and long-haul flights with a duvet and a mattress. We cut back on catering quite significantly, which also freed up galley space because you reduced the number of ovens, reduced the food you needed to carry. Was still available, of course, for those who wanted it, but just a more cut-back proposition. The space which you saved by reducing the galley, you put back into seats. So we didn't compromise on seat count by doing this. We just took away monuments, took away galley space, replaced it with flat seats. Took away the amenity kits, and led to basically a significant improvement in customer satisfaction from just basically adjusting the product. Changed the product so the lights were off all the way until landing, so people slept, and many people actually didn't even want the food at all. So it was a win-win both in terms of improving the customer experience, reducing the cost, and reducing the demand. The other way of reducing demand is continually looking for kind of lowest NPV. As I mentioned earlier, this industry has tended to favor avoiding capital commitments in favor of OpEx. And history has played a big part here. The fact that we've all been losing money for 20 years and cash has always been tight has been a key driver of this. What's that led us to do? It's led us to lease planes rather than purchase. Leasing has increased year by year by year. It's led us to sign power by the hour contracts. We've outsourced stuff like fuel infrastructure. We've moved IT contracts to transaction-based. And all of this probably is not the right choice in terms of NPV. It's the right choice in terms of short-term cash savings, but it's not the right choice in terms of longer-term value. Now, we saw earlier that industry is actually making money at the moment. In our view, now is a great time to actually reinvest in some capital expenditure to try and reset costs over time. For example, just picking on some of them, like if you are an established carrier and you expect to be operating the planes for most of their lifetime, it's definitely a better idea to purchase them than to lease them. Like, leasing companies make money for a reason. And that's because of airlines' short-termism. IT contracts. One of my clients basically bought out its IT provider, switched it from being a pure per-transaction cost model to saying, look, we're going to invest, build this ourselves, and then each marginal transaction is going to be almost free. Fuel infrastructure. One of my clients said, okay, look, we need to make a step change in terms of how much we're paying for fuel, and there's a monopoly provider at our airport. We're going to invest in our own fuel farm. We think it's right to put in the tanks, put in the pipes, because it creates a competitive supply in that particular city. Just another example of sort of getting this trade-off right. This is Qantas's one, in terms of understanding what the customer wants. You might have seen it, but this is what Qantas did to the long-haul meal service. Removed the tray is the key thing. Removed the airport caterer from the production of the equipment. And moved to something which was basically simpler, larger, good quality, but by basically being able to tap into a much larger range of off-airport catering suppliers, was able to reduce supply chain costs by 40%. And they reinvested that, probably about half of that, into the product, so kind of made it a bit bigger, made it a bit better, but the other part was taken as cost saving. It was also quicker to serve. The customers liked it because they got their meal quicker. It freed up flight attendant time, so they could do other things, in particular sell duty-free. And it's been one of the options where I think everyone's looked at it and gone like, okay, yes, this is actually a really good trade-off. Not only is this one on the left 40% cheaper, but it also actually improved customer satisfaction. And it's that thinking outside the box. What can I do to change what we offer to the customers that led to this innovation? Procurement, in our view, has a role here. This isn't the business customer experience team deciding it. Why did procurement need to be involved? Well, because a whole range of new suppliers, taking it off airport, imagining there's a world beyond Gate Gourmet and LSG and so on who can cook food. Procurement, though, needs to earn the right to be involved early. And in our view, a lot of that's down to people. We think one of the key things to do is to split the roles within procurement. So taking some of the more strategic parts out from the more just sort of contract administration. And then within that, having a series of category managers who, in most cases, sit with the business. So they might report centrally up to procurement, but where are they? They're actually physically sitting in each of the teams, and they're seen as an integral partner to those teams in helping shape the product that we offer, who we're going to buy it from, and then ultimately, how much do we pay for it? You remember the GPE survey we showed earlier, the Global Purchasing Excellence Survey. The single biggest driver of procurement success is actually people, it's capabilities and culture. So as much as we might talk about, okay, great category management or great strategic posture, it's actually the people which are the single biggest determining factor between high-performing procurement organizations and lower. If we were to look at this in terms of shifts, in some carriers, I'm not going to say yours, but procurement can be seen as a backwater, whereas it needs to be seen as, hey, this is a great training ground for future airline leaders. Everyone gets rotated through procurement at the moment. We actually think you don't want a team full of procurement specialists. You actually want airline generalists who get rotated through procurement. So they move on to leadership positions in the airline, understanding procurement. We typically see you focusing on kind of intrinsics, the right attitude, and then teaching the skills on the job to get to the things at the bottom. So procurement is not a necessary evil which the business is forced to engage and so does it as late as possible, but it's a valued partner engaged early. And procurement's role is not we manage contracts. It's like we're spending our money. We're spending the airline's money, and we're going to do the best possible. We talked about monopoly suppliers or duopoly suppliers earlier. This is the time to really push creativity, and this is where procurement can play a really strong role. I could talk for a long time on these, but really thinking about who else can we buy from for different categories. On the aircraft side, making sure that whenever you're going out for a new order, you're also talking to the leasing companies. You're looking at the second-hand market, and you're showing Boeing or Airbus that there's a real trade-off here, that we're considering something else instead of just buying the new. Low-cost country sourcing. Like obviously China, where I'm based, can produce things at a significantly cheaper price. And this is things, a lot of the onboard things, like where are your uniforms being made or your catering providers being made? So are you fully tapping into low-cost country sourcing? Really pushing the aperture in terms of who can supply you on things. You probably can't see it, but this is this was one I saw at Pudong Airport in Shanghai. Like EVA Airways didn't like the limited choice of lounge providers at the airport, so they just started giving you a voucher for a restaurant instead. What happened? Fairly quickly, the lounge providers dropped their cost and came back. So it's kind of thinking, okay, well, are there other ways I can provide that to the customer? And the DHL one is famous. Like British Airways in London uses DHL as its catering provider. It's the same kind of idea as we saw with Qantas. Catering at the airport is mostly a logistics capability. It's not a cooking capability. There are lots of people in cheaper places that who can cook for significantly less, and it's a broader supply market. Making sure that you're always using, or at least considering, third parties parts rather than always going back to the OEM. Delta, when you walked into its engineering units, basically the place where all suppliers would come, there was a big showcase in the entrance about here's all the third-party parts we're using, to just remind the suppliers when they came in that, look, you need to be giving us good, honest pricing, or we're going to use third parties. And then really starting to use some of the supply chain and procurement tools to understand suppliers' costs. Things such as clean sheets, auctions, and so on to push down the costs. Technology helps us with all this. Here's a long range of different things which we see teams using. Frankly, all of them are helpful. The single most important thing, as we talked about earlier, is people, but people supported by the right tools is the model for success. To pick on some of them, obviously, getting the hands around the total procurement spend. In our view, the procurement team should be looking at sort of 80 to 90% of the total spend of the airline should be within procurement. Many airlines I've seen, some departments will push back on that and go like, oh, no, wait, engineering, maintenance is too special to give to procurement. But that's not our view. Our view is that, great, we'll have somebody sitting in procurement, from procurement, in engineering with you, working with you day to day, but still, we want to be across 80 to 90% of the spend. Having the analytics, so the spend cube, really understanding how much do we spend with suppliers, is step number one. And many airlines we've been to don't even have a particularly strong grasp on this. Then a series of tools to help you around collaborative sourcing. We've seen some carriers be successful with things such as clean sheets. I'll show you one in a minute. For some of the more commoditized practices, an airline I worked with moved to reverse auctions for its uniform providers, for example. Getting procurement out of actually invoicing, so kind of get as much as possible automating that and the compliance management. And then moving into supplier performance. And obviously SAP will talk much more about their views on this as well. One example, so we worked with this one was a manufacturer, so it was an aerospace company, basically really trying to capture the information, saving sort of 10% or so in savings through some of these tools around looking at the spend intelligence and the analytics. One I did, we looked at a clean sheet, so kind of building up the supplier's cost of ground handling. So with ground handling, you always do have a competitive option, or at least in most cases you have a competitive option, and that's, I'll do it myself. Now in most airports you don't want to do it yourself because it's difficult to manage and like it's complex, but you do have that option. So being able to understand, okay, what are all the activities needed, how much do we think it's costing them, let's add it together, understand what we think our supplier's cost is, and then use that as a negotiating tool against them. We were able to save an airline hundreds of millions across its locations through having that detailed, in-depth understanding. So let me finish here, but I very much welcome discussion, and especially after the other speakers speak. Key messages. Procurement's role is going to become more important than ever. Like, despite this industry actually making money at the moment in the short term, we fear this isn't going to last. It is still a highly competitive industry with cutthroat pricing, oversupply. We fear that this industry is going to continue to have difficult years. Costs only go in one direction, and that's down. Given the factor costs are going up, it's creativity and innovation which helps us drive those costs down. Airlines, at least as we've surveyed them, do lag best practice today in procurement, but we don't see any reason why they need to. By becoming the partner of the business, getting involved early, earning the right to be involved early, being creative in terms of alternative suppliers, leading procurement teams can really help their airlines to emerge as the success. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion over the next day or so. Thank you.
Just stay up here for a few questions from me, and then maybe I'll prime the pump here and then open it up to the audience. One that just came to mind as you were talking about collaboration or clean sheeting, which maybe collaboration and clean sheet can be quite different. But what is the supply? When you look at the airline supply base, what is their capability to truly collaborate, to truly innovate? What are you seeing on the supply side working with the airlines?
Typically not that strong because they've never really had to. The suppliers there's not a huge competitive supply base out there. For many of these categories, you've got a limited number of providers. You're talking about airports, and some of them are actually relatively small-scale businesses. Even if they're part of a global group, you're working with the local team, and so they're not really used to dealing with these sophisticated approaches. That doesn't mean that they don't work, though.
Right.
And part of the job of a procurement team is to help its suppliers professionalize. Like, of course, we're all in search of this win-win, which we call it, but they do exist out there. Like, what are the things which you as an airline are doing and specifying which are increasing cost at your suppliers? So getting into those discussions where you actually sit down and you plan these things together, you do find opportunities. Some examples, I worked with a ground handling provider, and its airline counterpart was specifying, okay, you need to change into our uniform before you serve our customers. Here's the things you need to do. And just by getting together, they were realizing, okay, well, how much does this cost? What value does this really add?
Yep.
And the outcome was, we no longer need to change into the uniforms. We'll just put on the different badge. So I think, look, what is the capability? For most, I'd say relatively low. Obviously, there are exceptions. The sales teams of Boeing and Airbus are very skilled, and understand every single pushback a procurement team has and present you with a raft of data.
Yeah, that may not be, like Boeing and Airbus may not be where the real innovation happens, I think. But what you're also saying in that, and you can confirm this, is that procurement might have to change the approach to the supply base and actually not make it a price war or feature function, check the box. It might be true collaboration and be willing to invest in their suppliers and bring them along because it will drive that win-win scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And there may even be cases where you want to actively support a supplier to ensure that the supply base continues to remain competitive.
Right, and that may be different than the approach today.
Yeah, so certainly I worked with one client at an airport who was actively invested in helping a new fuel supplier come on board so that they weren't subject to the monopoly previously.
Yeah.
Now, that meant they paid higher prices for a few years, but that meant by introducing the new supplier to the market, they kept the current supplier honest as well.
Okay. Okay, another question. I think the RAS-CAS slide you showed was, probably depressing to a lot of people to say everything we save goes to someone else. But is there anybody that stands out? Are there areas that when you think about that, to say they stand out, and in what way, or is that just the industry? I mean, that was an industry summary. Yeah. Is there anyone that stands out that's been able to maintain more revenue?
Yeah, so of course, yes, there are, and there are airlines who've consistently outperformed and returned cost of capital over the cycles. Mm-hmm. That includes some of the leading low-cost carriers. So Ryanair and EasyJet are up there on that list. Emirates is up there on that list. We think that the things which really set apart the leaders. The first one is actually, it's all about competition. The less you compete with other airlines, the more you're able to get a privileged position. So Emirates does a fantastic job through its network, connecting. It might carry a lot of people from London to Bangkok, but it doesn't make much money on those. It's the few passengers a day who are traveling on the niche routes. Mm-hmm. So the more protected markets that you have where you're not subject to competition is actually the single most important factor. But amongst that list is also, you've got a brand which people love. There is a strong correlation between good customer experience and financial returns, and having sustainably lower factor costs than other airlines.
Yeah, and that customer experience might mean that it just matches their expectation.
Right, it's not about having the best everywhere.
So to your point earlier, right, yeah.
It's about understanding what your customer pays for and delivering very well on it. Like, who comes out top in all the surveys? It's still Southwest in the US. Yeah. Not because it's got a fantastic, it's because it delivers very well on what it promises and gives you.
Okay, and then the final question for me, for the procurement and supply chain professionals in the room that may get involved later in the process and really do want to change that, are inspired by what you talked about, by being, earlier on in the process, innovating and collaborating. What advice would you have for those individuals about how they can change the perception or the reality in their organizations?
Start with the people. Like, the procurement needs to earn the right. So you add value by being involved early. You get involved early by the business wanting you to be involved early. Like, procurement being forced on departments because, you have to go through procurement is not the answer. So making sure that the leaders of procurement know and are respected by the business leaders, that you build up teams which are full of mixtures of procurement professionals, but airline generalists. Get some of the higher performing people to rotate through procurement, have them sitting in the teams and playing that role of being the supportive partner to the business. We're not just here to get you the best price once you've chosen your supplier. We're here to help you right up front, shape the demand. What should we be offering? How do we expand the supply base and work together? So start from the people. It's the single biggest correlation factor to success is the people.
That's good advice. Okay, I want to open it up to the audience and see what questions exist.
My name is Fermin. I'm from Nostrum, Spain, regional airline. Great presentation, Steve. Is our life. Clearly, it's our day-to-day, fighting with reducing costs and find a best way of put costs down. My question is about another perspective. We already know that most of the airlines are competitors. However, from the perspective of supply chain, what do you think about airline collaboration? Airline collaboration together just to put pressure in aircraft manufacturer, in suppliers, just to keep the cost at a reasonable level.
Good question. So there have been a number of attempts at this. Many of you might have seen some of the things the alliances tried to do on procurement. Like I think it was Star Alliance tried to design a standard economy class seat which got installed across all of them, and let's try and use our combined purchasing power. Not seen much of that work. And typically because the alliances are too big and there's too many different interests. So even when you define the common seat, people wanted to start to customize it for their own needs. Where there clearly has been success is where there's common ownership across the airlines. So you look at what IAG is now able to do, or what even Indigo Partners did with its latest aircraft order, just kind of bulking together many of its different airlines and using that power to negotiate directly with the supplier. That works, but that's common ownership. I think the question is, can you collaborate together successfully without common ownership? And I've not seen that much of it. It happens sometimes at a very local level, like at a number of airports. You'll have sort of airline groups who come together to discuss, okay, how can we try and improve the handler or the fuel provider? But usually the carriers are not sufficiently interested. Apart from the single hub carrier, it's not enough of the cost base to really get them excited. So I've not seen it be terribly successful unless there's the common ownership, but I welcome anyone who has made it work.
Another question from the audience? Thank you, Steve.
Steve, this is Sami from Saudi Airlines. Thank you. This is Sami from Saudi Arabian Airlines. You emphasize a lot on getting the right tool and the staffs. But don't you think also that improving the internal business processes is one of the most effective factors to have really excellence in procurement and overall strategy?
Yes, of course it helps. The risk is that it ends up being forced on the business and gets resentment, though. I've seen a number of carriers where the procurement starts to put in place a process, here's what you need to do, and businesses just go and find creative ways around it. So yes, you can do some through enforcement of process, but you need to get people to trust in that process, and that's about becoming the business partner. A number of carriers I've worked with, it's got to the situation where all urgent procurements end up getting a CEO or somebody else's sign-off to bypass a series of steps within that process. So there's risks to it as well. Equally on the other side, I've worked with some carriers who are totally undisciplined and they don't even have POs, and there's no checking of invoice against goods receipt or anything like that. So yes, absolutely, there's a place for process, but I'd still stress winning the trust of the business rather than trying to enforce process.
You're talking about the maturity curve of the operations today to say, where are you in that? If you don't have base fundamentals in place, you've got to get that, and then you can truly talk about innovating.
Yeah, but even to get the fundamentals, you need the business to buy in that it's going to improve their life. It's not just making their life more difficult.
Okay. Yeah. Good. I want to check real quick in the back. How are we on time? Are we okay? Yeah. Okay, great. I can take another question then from the audience.
Thank you, Steve. This is Dolph from Air France KLM mainly. You stated that critical is to be involved early from a procurement point of view. Also stated that by earning this role, and then you also said something like being close to the business. Can you elaborate a little bit on that part of your vision?
So to get involved early, it's really shaping the demand. So if you were to break down procurement, it's sort of, okay, what are we going to buy? How much of it are we going to buy? who are we going to buy from, what's the price? And procurement all kind of often gets brought in on what's the price, but the kind of right up front, what are we going to buy, adds a lot more value. Now, in order to be able to have influence on what are we going to buy, the business needs to respect the point of view of procurement and feel that they're actually adding value to that discussion. So the example we looked at earlier, do you want great business class seats, or do you want duvets, or kind of product definition? The customer experience team is always going to say, look, we know the customer, we've done our surveys and so on. Procurement can play a role, though, in being the critical friend, helping make sure that cost is being factored into those decisions. But that's right up front. For procurement to get involved in those discussions, though, the business needs to bring it into those discussions. Now, there's also being close. So being close to the business means having the right expertise and being brought in early. There's also close to just physically. Like, one of the things I really like is airlines who procurement is more of a virtual organization. So you report to procurement, but your day job, you're sitting together with the team in customer experience or engineering or aircraft, or you are part of that team. You just then have a reporting link up to procurement, but your day to day is you're part of that team who's defining the customer experience.
Just as an add-on, in the end, procurement is... As an add-on, in the end, procurement is about bringing in the negotiation skills, maintain a relationship with suppliers. Building out those skills when you are basically scattered over the businesses, how you should organize that according to you?
I've not seen it be a problem, because you still get together as procurement every so often. You'll have your procurement meetings. You rotate people across categories. So obviously not too frequently, because you're trying to build up particular expertise. But the person who has been negotiating sort of ground handling moves on to let's go and do corporate services. I've actually seen the bigger risk is that you don't understand the business rather than that you don't understand the procurement. At least that's what I've seen with the carriers that I work with.
Question up front here, right down.
This is Mohammed Al-Nuwaisa from Saudi Airlines. I'm just recalling what you said earlier about involve early in the process. I mean, what do you think that it's the right approach to do that, particularly when you basically end up in the last phase of the procuring?
Probably try and work step by step. So if you had the 4 different steps, what do we buy? How much of it do we buy? Who do we buy from? What price do we pay? If you're here, try and move back 1 step. If you're here, try to move back 1 step. The risk is procurement is brought in only when there's in effect 1 supplier you can choose from, or maybe 2, and told, oh, go and negotiate. And fine, you can do that, you can go and sign a contract, but you're not going to get significant savings without stimulating some alternative suppliers, challenging how much of it we're going to buy, thinking again about whether we even need this thing. But if you're here and you're only saying, okay, your job's to administer contracts, at least taking the next step in terms of, okay, let's get involved in supplier development, more in terms of the negotiations, the auctions and supply development, that's probably the next step. And then beyond that, getting into what's the specification? So it's probably step by step. But you need the business to want you to do it, which is why I keep saying that it's all about building. So if you're only here, build the trust to let you make these steps backwards up the chain.
Super. Very good. Steve, I want to thank you again for joining and sharing your insights, and for the Q&A here today, and I'm excited to have you spend time with the group for the rest of the day.
Okay,
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.